Hello, this video is going to review gender and how it relates to education and diversity within education. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the background on gender. And of course, when we speak of gender, we're talking about male and female, even though now there's also convolution of what groups identify with, biological gender versus mentality gender. So we don't get that far into things, but we are speaking of, again, mainly male and female here. So let's talk a little bit about how the gender wars, if you will, kind of began. So in colonial America, there's always been a disconnect or a unfairness, if you will, among genders. So in colonial America, less than one-third of women could actually sign their name. They were not taught writing like the males were. Instead, they were taught domestic skills. So again, how to be a wife, how to be a parent, because that was their main duty in life. They were taught how to read, interestingly enough, and the goal was for them to be able to read the Bible to their children. Again, keeping in mind what we've learned about colonial America, with the focus being on Protestant religion and there not being a separation of church and state. So the majority of it was being able to read the Bible to their children. At that point, women were viewed as mentally and morally inferior to men, which was interesting because often we think of academics and mentally and that kind of thing, IQ, but we don't necessarily think of morally. But at that point, women were considered morally inferior to men as well. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that women were allowed or even considered to go to Ivy League schools, so the prestigious colleges, and we're talking pretty recently, 1970s and 1980s. During colonial America, though, as things began to change, seminary schools were created that did allow women to go to training. I guess you could call it college. It was more like training. But there was a difficulty there because society really wasn't ready for it. So you would have these educated women come out of seminary school, and they were kind of somewhat of an outcast because they were so different, and so many people were opposed to it. So from seminary schools, these women that graduated from seminary schools were allowed to become teachers, and actually 80% of the graduates from seminary schools did become teachers. Interestingly, school districts hired these female teachers very quickly and sometimes hired them over the males. And the reason why was because they could pay them less. They paid them one-third of the salary that they paid the males. So it wasn't necessarily that they valued them more, that they thought that they had more potential than the males. It was mainly because they could pay them less. Also, what brought about more females in education, especially higher education, was the financial crunch during the end of the Civil War. So during the end of the Civil War, obviously they had lost a lot of males to the war. They needed tuition dollars, so they allowed females to go into college. So it wasn't really that their mindset changed that females were now mentally equal to males. It was because they needed money. So they were allowed to go to college because it's short of attendance, but they were still treated very poorly by males as well as their professors. So there was still kind of this separate but equal thing going on with gender that has been kind of a thread within gender and race and socioeconomic status that we've discussed before. What I found hugely interesting was the medical viewpoint of women being inferior to men. There was a article published, and this is of course 1873, so long, long time ago, called Sex and Education, and it was by a doctor, and this doctor was actually Harvard medical staff. And he suggested that women should not be able to attend high school or college because it would be detrimental to their health. Particularly, the blood that would be destined for their ovaries and child development would be redirected to their brain, therefore giving a potential for them to become sterile and not able to bear children if they went to college. So therefore, women needed a less demanding education, easier courses, no competition, and often rest periods because their brain was smaller than males and they were too vulnerable. And a lot of people bought into this and did not send their females to high school and college and allowed them to go to either a vocational school or allowed them just to become domestic workers because not necessarily because they felt like their children were inferior, but because the medical staff was saying that it could be detrimental to their health. And so the female reaction to this, I think, is quite noteworthy. And this was from M. Carey Thomas, who was one of the first presidents of a college, and she was one of the first women to earn a PhD in the United States. And she said when she read about this and when she read about women's health being affected by their ability to become educated, that she said, I often remember praying about it, begging God that if it were true that I would be a girl and I was not successfully able to master Greek and go to college and understand these things, to please just kill me for it. So again, it wasn't that women were receptive to this idea, but it was kind of accepted. So as we think about this, obviously there's a drastic difference now, but do we still somewhat think like this? Are there subjects that we consider too stressful for women? Also, in popular media, do we consider highly educated women to be less attractive than those of not so educated? So do we consider, when we're looking at what should make a quote unquote perfect woman, do we look at academics? Do we look at mentality? Do we look at degree standing, that kind of thing? So again, we don't do it on that scale, but is there still some of this somewhat lying around? So when women were allowed to go to college, it was overwhelmingly white women going to college. And during that time, it began to, because women were beginning to go to college, it delayed them getting married and having children because they, again, were going to college. In comparison, black women were not allowed to go to college, as in black males and females at this point were not allowed to go to college anyways, and so they continued to have children. And that was a risk of what they call the quote-unquote white establishment, because there was a fear that white women were going to not reproduce as quickly and black women were going to reproduce more children, and therefore you would have an outweighing of the black versus the white, and that could be detrimental to the quote-unquote white establishment. So that was another reason why women were not encouraged to go to college, because more of a racial issue, in addition to the gender. So Title IX came around, and I'm sure you're familiar with Title IX, and it is based upon gender, but it basically says that gender cannot be that genders, be it male or female, cannot be excluded from participation in or discriminated against enrollment in education programs or activities if that program or activity receives federal assistance. You see this most in sports. So we can't have a bunch of sports and pour a lot of money into sports for guys and say, sorry ladies, we don't have any money for you, you can't do sports. That is against Title IX and is considered illegal. But it does go beyond sports. It goes into things like clubs, certain courses. So we can't say, hey, we're going to have this club for males, but we're not going to have one for females, even though the females want it because we don't have enough money for it. It's not allowed. It also includes things like college admission, employment, and hiring. So you often see this on hiring applications, that you don't discriminate, that, this employer does not discriminate against race, gender, socioeconomic status, all these different things. And so what you cannot do when you're looking to hire someone is say, you know what, I'm looking to hire a male, so I'm going to filter all these applications by male and throw out all the females. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to discriminate by any particular subgroup, especially things like gender and race. So when we look at boys versus girls, and we try to compare, because this is often a conversation that teachers have, is do boys and girls learn differently? How different are boys and girls biologically, mentally, emotionally, socially, that kind of thing? And when you look at research, what you actually find is there are actually more differences between diversities of boys and between diversities of girls than girls versus boys. So for example, there are more diversity among girls in terms of their race, socioeconomic status, language background, and educational background than there are boys and girls of the same race, boys and girls of socioeconomic status, boys and girls of different language backgrounds. So what I'm trying to say here is that girls and boys of the same race are actually more similar than girls of one race and girls of another race. So we say that this is a difference. That students are more alike they're more different between or within gender, they're more different within genders versus between genders. So a couple of things that research has pulled out, though, about boys and girls is that, for example, boys are often associated with having poor achievement, especially in language and writing. They're often more likely to be referred to special education and more likely to have discipline problems. However, that's not true actually for all boys. It's the low-income English learner and minority boys that tend to have most of these problems. So it's the minority boys that are more likely to be referred for a special education. It is the minority boys that are more likely to have poor achievement in school. It's not all boys, so we have to be careful about when we say all or none. A couple of differences though. With girls, they're more likely to have higher grades, fewer disciplinary problems, and are actually more likely to go to college. And we say, well, why is that? Why do girls tend to do better in school? And one way to attribute it, one reason, and again, there's not one generic reason, but one of them is that girls are expected to please others. They're taught early on to please, while boys are often taught to kind of go against the grain. So since they're meant to please others, they try not to give the teacher problems. They're more likely to follow directions and therefore more likely to do well in school. That sounds like a plus. However, it also results in lower self-esteem and less independence. So when women are asked to think for themselves, that is often difficult for girls because they really haven't been raised that way. Interestingly, half of the students in grades 3 through 12 believe that the most important thing for females to do is to get married and have children. So that kind of says a lot in that one statement. When comparing academic attitudes, boys often view reading and writing as a feminine trait. They enjoy reading books less, taking fewer notes, and studying less. However, they do evaluate their academic abilities higher than females. So an interesting take on that. When you look at dropouts, girls, while boys are more likely to drop out of school than girls, when girls leave school, they're less likely to return to actually complete that degree. So when they drop out, they usually drop out for good. Again, speaking on saying all boys and all girls, 1/4 of 1 out of 4 boys who fall into the following categories will probably drop out of school. And again, it's what we typically look at when we look at things like having problems in school, which is being a minority, being an English learner, and being from a low-income family. So if you fall into those characteristics, 1 in 4 boys in those categories are going to drop out of school. Continuing looking at boys versus girls, when you look at college enrollment, from the colonial period up into the 1980s, men kind of won out. Men were the majority at college. Looking at the colonial period, again, women weren't allowed in college for a while, up into the 1980s. Now, however, there's actually more women are the majority in college. The least likely groups to go to college are minorities and low-income men. So males that fall into being a minority as well as falling into being low income are the least likely to go to college. Overall, however, there are more men and women going to college than ever before, but men are still the majority at prestigious colleges. So that's an interesting take, that while there's more women in college in general, there are more men at prestigious colleges. So similar to college enrollment and degree attainment, you look at earnings. Women still earn less than men at every single level of education attainment. So you take a man and a woman that have a bachelor's degree, man gets more money. You look at men and women who have a master's degree, men makes more money. You look at women and men who have doctoral degrees, men make more money. So every educational level, men are out earning women. Also, female high school graduates may earn up to 1/3 less than their male counterparts. So we're not talking a little bit of a pay decrease. We're talking 1/3 less. For example, female physicians can earn up to 40% less than other male physicians. Female teachers can earn up to 20% less than male teachers. So something to kind of keep in mind. Also, when we start to look at boys and girls in curriculum and textbooks, we see that especially in elementary texts, males outnumber females 2 to 1. So for every image or every character in textbooks, there's going to be 2 males for every 1 female. So males are still kind of the predominant in those. Also, there's some stereotyping that goes on there. Males are often considered aggressive. They tend to want to be in charge, be the leader, chase others, causing trouble in these curriculum and in these textbooks. If you were to pick up a novel and read it, or a child's book, you're likely to see males being aggressive. You're also likely to see fathers being very hands-off or absent altogether. So if you look at a children's book and it talks about the family, you may see the father very much in passing, or you may not see him at all. In contrast, the women are often considered affectionate and more of the nurturing role. The traditional roles of female in books includes things like flight attendant, maid, librarian, while the traditional roles of males are more aggressive. Again, fighters, adventurers, rescuers, police officers, firefighters, that kind of thing. So you kind of see these traditional roles taking on in curriculum and textbooks. So looking at a null curriculum, the null curriculum is what is not taught in school. And often you see what is not taught in school in is things related to women and African Americans. So your text gives an example of name 10 famous white men in history. And if you were to do that, you could probably name 10 famous white men in history. You would name a bunch of presidents, you would name political leaders, you would name things like that. If you were asked to name 10 famous women in history, you may struggle. If you were asked to name 10 famous African Americans in history, you also may struggle. When you are asked to name 10 famous African Americans, often people go to celebrities or they go to civil rights leaders, big name leaders like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, that kind of thing. So again, what is not taught in schools is we really fail to highlight a lot of women, a lot of minorities, in our context. We tend to inadvertently focus on white men in history. So what are some ways that when you're looking at text as a teacher, can you help to identify bias in the curriculum and in the textbooks? What are some things to look for? One is to look for stereotyping, saying we are all this, all boys do this, all girls do this. For example, textbooks that portray all African American males or females as athletes. That's not true. Not all African American males or females are athletic. All Mexicans as laborers, all women as caretakers. Every book that you have in your classroom should not have women as stay-at-home moms. That's fine to have some, but that's a stereotype. Also, another thing to look at is the imbalance or one-only perspective. So, and we've talked a little bit about this before when we're looking at multicultural education. So things like a book that only looks at Thanksgiving from the European viewpoint. So do we have any textbooks that show Thanksgiving and how it came to be from the Native American viewpoint? Or looking at slavery from an African American perspective only? Are there any textbooks out there? Are there any storybooks out there that talk about slavery from the viewpoint of the European, why they had slavery, what their viewpoints on slavery was? So looking at more than one perspective on these issues. Another thing that you want to be careful about is situations that are unrealistic or what we call make-believe. Things like a perfect family, which you often see in textbooks or in storybooks. You see the perfect family of a dad and a mom and 4 kids or 2 kids and a dog and a picket fence and all this kind of stuff. What about single parents? What about divorced parents? What about blended families of stepchildren, half-children, that kind of thing? What about grandparents as parents? Do you have those diversity represented? Because that's the real reality of a lot of families. Also, things like pretending racism, sexism, and ageism doesn't exist. Having this perfect white picket fence plot and characters in all of your textbooks, really no one identifies with that because that's not reality. A couple of other things to look for are fragmentation or highlights. And you see this a lot in textbooks where you have your regular textbook and then you see this little subset outside highlighting someone of interest. So women in science or famous African Americans, as if those people aren't part of the full or regular history. So I see people are probably doing that to highlight, to bring your attention to women, to bring your attention to minorities. But again, that's not really appropriate because they're part of the real story to begin with. Also, looking at language, things like using emphasis on male forefathers, mankind, businessmen, that kind of thing. Always using he instead of he or she, that kind of thing. It seems pretty simplistic, but over time that can inadvertently send females the message that they don't matter as much. Also, there's something called cosmetic bias, to where when you look at the cover of a textbook or you look at the images of a textbook and you think, wow, that is not what real people look like. So you look at images of, again, it's mainly celebrities, it's mainly models, it's mainly people of a certain look, and you think, I don't even know anybody that looks like that. Let's get some real images of some real people. So that's what a cosmetic bias is. And again, those are things that you can look for when you're picking textbooks, when you're picking curriculum, or when you're picking picture books, things like that for your classroom. So another thing to keep in mind with gender is obviously the majority of schools have a diversity of genders. So it's co-ed, so you have males and females in the same school. In the past, there have been single-sex schools that was considered not appropriate, and they have integrated by gender. It's not actually, though, illegal to have an all-girl or an all-boys school. Now, that's different for race. Obviously, it is illegal to have all black or all white schools, but there isn't a law per se against that. Usually you have to give a good reason for it. And some people have created, or there are some single-sex schools out there. There's actually some single-sex colleges out there, all-girl college, all-boy college, and there are actually some public schools out there like that. And some believe that it helps students focus more and removes competition, because if you're not trying to impress the girls, you're not trying to impress the boys, then maybe you're more likely to focus on your studies. But then again, keep in mind diversity. What if you went to school your whole life with only girls or only boys, and then you're out to the workforce with other genders? How do you know how to respond? Do you know how to work with those different groups of people? Keeping in mind, as we've discussed, there are more differences within genders. So girls of different diversity are actually more different than between genders, so boys versus girls. So we always say, boys are different than girls. Actually, girls are different amongst themselves and boys are different amongst themselves than between. So keep that in mind. And again, that's kind of a heated debate. So I encourage you to think about, kind of the pros and cons to single-sex schools. Could they be beneficial or could they be actually more detrimental? So again, that's kind of a summary, very brief summary of what gender is like and some of the issues that we have within public schools.